David, why don't we start with you? I've known you longer.
All right.
When I wrote a couple stories, actually several stories on your work, you were known for resveratrol and the early work you did on that. And maybe you could explain that, how you got into the longevity field and then maybe what you're working on now.
Sure. Well, I've been interested in longevity since I was 4 years old. I think a lot of us realize what a tragedy it is to lose the people around us and eventually head off into oblivion, in my view. So I've been fascinated in trying to figure out what to do about it, not just for my own sake, but of course because I think that the world will be an incredible place when we don't have to worry about dying at 80 or 90 from a horrible chronic disease. It also has economic benefits. So I'm hoping that within our lifetimes we will be able to have a world that is the beginning of that. I don't think we're ever going to finish this quest. There's not going to be one magic pill in the next few years that's going to cure aging. But we certainly have the technologies now. So the resveratrol story came out now over 10 years ago from my lab at Harvard. And we were looking for small molecules that would activate an enzyme that we found ostensibly controls the aging process in yeast through mammals. And we did a random screen. We found this molecule, resveratrol. I Googled it, and red wine came up, and it was in red wine, and I saw my future on that screen. So now what we're working on is there's a few other companies, about 7 since then. And what I think the most relevant to this one is that there's a new molecule that is called NAD, which raises the activity of a whole class of enzymes that are involved in longevity, and we think that will have even greater benefits than the original molecules. The original work on resveratrol continues after hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. It's not an easy thing developing a drug, but the new molecules look really good. We're going into human studies next year in healthy volunteers, and with the hope that we can treat one disease and eventually treat dozens of them with the same or related medicines.
That's fantastic. And June, tell us a little bit about why are you interested in longevity?
Right, and what I love about this field, and I met David probably 15 years ago when he was first doing the work, but you can come at this from so many different angles, and my personal background was in biology, and specifically I was coming from evolutionary biology. In college, I was a bio major, and I had the privilege of just knocking on doors of the biologists I used to read about, Gould, Lewontin, E.O. Wilson. One of the most compelling ideas I came across in evolutionary biology is the idea that senescence might actually be a beneficial trait. There's an old idea promulgated by August Weismann in the 1800s. The idea basically was that senescence was a way to get out of the way the better versions of ourselves. Our children are hopefully more fit than we are, and then when you have resource constraints, essentially cycled the old parts out to make new ones. So you are sequentially innovating through evolution. Now that idea was around for many years until it was killed in 1953 by a comment from Peter Medawar, who said that senescence can only be weakly reflected in selection because it occurs after reproduction. Now, that makes sense for maybe women, but men reproduce into their senescence. And arguably, even reproductive senescence in women should have been selected towards longevity. There should have been runaway selection for extending reproductive senescence. Anyway, none of that happened. Arguably, Medawar's argument is a fallacy, but at the minimum, it's the road not taken. Since 1953, if you thought about the fact that senescence was as an adaptive trait, you basically lost your funding if you said that out loud. But now, it's back on the table. 60 years later, people are starting to think about, what is the code for senescence? What is the code for aging? Is there a code that can be deciphered, and can we hack that code to take a completely different end run around senescence? Ironically, 1953 happens to be the year that Watson and Crick discovered the double helix shape. So the year we discovered the code of life is the year we stopped looking for the code of death. So I think that's one of the grand swings and misses in biological history. We did a lot of great work over the last 60 years. We discovered molecular biology. We've, as an industry and as a scientific field, helped extend the quality and quantity of people's lives. But as good as the system is right now, the current healthcare system, this is the riskiest path, right? Because we're basically, as we make people live longer without curing aging, we create more old people. So this is a vicious cycle of rising healthcare consumption, which is going to kill the economy eventually. And the second fatal flaw of the current path is everybody dies. So this is the least interesting solution. And right now we're stuck in this little local minimum of iterating around this, but is there a much better global minimum out there in thinking about senescence? And that's what got me into the field. Like, this is the road not taken, the idea of pursuing aging, the causes of aging, rather than the symptoms of aging, which is largely what we're addressing today.
What is the most important technology to each of you that might get us there? Or maybe, I mean, there's several that, you know, I've written about, you all have talked about, you know, genetics, regenerative therapies. Is there something we haven't thought of? What's top on your list? Why are we even here talking about this in terms of technology?
Well, I'll talk about two things. DNA editing is great, but I think that's further into the future for practical purposes. Sorry, George. What I think is realistic is in the next few years we will have a drug that is actually shown to delay aspects of aging and even reverse aspects that we've been able to do in animals pretty easily these days. So I think the pharmaceutical side is the most realistic and promising. And it's not just the work that I talked about. There's a zeitgeist right now in the field of aging research. You go to a conference and people are no longer talking about, extending the lifespan of a worm or a fly. We really are pushing ahead as a field, starting companies, raising money to do true clinical trials. Now the technologies are quite broad. I could list 5 really promising ones, from deleting senescent cells to activating longevity defense pathways in the body. But I think it's going to take a combination of those technologies to really boost lifespan up to 150. But I think we've identified the major approaches. The other technology that I'm not as well known for talking about is something that is actually happening right now, and that is the ability to monitor your health and make adjustments, not in real time, but almost in real time. And Dave, you've written about this a lot. But I thought I'd bring it up because I find it really interesting. If you can see what your body looks like on the inside, and you get recommendations based on intelligent machines that are processing data from tens of thousands of data points and hundreds of thousands of publications, you can actually improve people's health, even better than a drug.
So June, what do you think?
I'm going to build on what David said, and there's so many exciting technologies that are out there. My personal interest is in actually insourcing the innovations through a prize mechanism, which is a way to pull innovation rather than pushing. And you're pulling it rather than pushing. So you're trying to solve very specific problems. And the problem we're interested in solving is optimizing for homeostatic capacity instead of homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is the word that we've all learned in biology class. It's the state of equilibrium. Homeostatic capacity is your ability to get to homeostasis. It's like the Weeble Wobble toy from the 1970s. So when you push it, it kind of self-centers. That's essentially what nature selects for, is capacity, and the state follows capacity. But in biology, we've largely been a state-based science, meaning when you go to your annual checkup, the doctor will measure your heart rate, blood pressure, glucose, and cholesterol. These are all state variables. But in fact, your heart rate is relatively stable your whole life, but your heart rate response to exercise is what declines and maps to biologic and chronologic age. And same thing with your blood pressure. Your blood pressure response from sitting to standing, that response is what declines with age. And the fact that in biology we're still living in a 3-dimensional field, we have not added the 4th dimension in biology. We don't have the time domain. We haven't added the 4th dimension. So what we're lacking in biology is temporal resolution. So when you don't have that, you manage the state instead of capacity, and we end up solving for state, but in fact your capacity continues to erode. I'm in the middle of my life, and I can feel my capacity eroding, my ability to tolerate temperature variance, altitude variance, late nights, injury. In every dimension, is it really inflammation that's causing my aging, or is it loss of inflammatory capacity? It's a loss of regenerative capacity. Add the word capacity next to everything, and you start considering system dynamics. Like we live in San Francisco. The way seismic scientists assess and forecast your upcoming collapse risk is not whether you're standing every year, which is what we're doing in medicine. It's you push it. You do resilience testing. You do responsive diagnostics. So in modern medicine, our current diagnostic system basically measures state, and so we're actually missing the opportunity to improve capacity, with the state being the result. Giving you blood pressure lowering medicine improves state, but it doesn't address capacity, which is why your baseline blood pressure gets worse. This is what's missing today. In fact, the idea there would be to give people blood pressure raising medicines as a way to induce capacity as a result you're looking for instead of state. So in other words, we haven't done anything yet in this field. This is all upside, and those are the technologies we're looking for, is technologies that improve system capacity and system dynamics instead of system state.
So that sounds like, in a way, an extension of living healthy, right? I mean, you're not talking about radical technologies there. Maybe some of the systems of measuring those things you're talking about. We're using more advanced technology. But does that get you to, radical life extension? Or is that, the theme here is longevity. It could be, and we're looking at these time frames of 80 or 100 or 120 or on out. Where do you sit on that spectrum?
Well, until age 40, our per annual mortality rate remains pretty low, about 0.1% per year. And even which is, if you could live at that rate of homeostatic capacity, how long you would live. You could do the math. If the annual mortality rate is 0.1% in a population under 40, you get the numbers that are crazy. But what you lose is after 40, your per annual mortality rates go up. Now, what's really compelling is the first 40 years, the causes of death are the slings and arrows of life. Trauma, infection, suicide, these are all externalities. But after 40, while these things persist, your intrinsic causes of death, chronic disease is what emerges, and that's what wipes you out by 120. So if you can figure out, homeostatic capacity is nature's greatest endowment. We don't realize we have it until we start losing it in the middle of our lives. Our kids have no idea what we're talking about, right? The feeling of healthy is the feeling of nothing, which is what we felt when we were 12 years old. We didn't feel energy or vitality. We felt nothing. And at my age, we feel something. You ask my parents, they feel everything, right? So we're in the sudden rate of decline after 40, but how do we just maintain that health or maintain high homeostatic capacity indefinitely? And that's what I think really would change the thinking about what is longevity. It's really about health, sustained health. I think we're all on the same page talking about that, rather than making old people live longer.
Okay. I want to address something about, you're talking about capacity or resilience. At the molecular level, we have, the field has a new understanding of what's going on with aging, and it relates to resilience. The old idea that you probably still hear about on the internet is that aging is caused by DNA damage and mutations, and they accumulate, and then things go wrong. What's actually more interesting is that we've discovered as a field recently that what's actually going on is that, yes, DNA damage accelerates aging. You go in the sun, you get burnt, you know what happens. But what's actually, we think is the cause of aging is that the epigenome is getting altered. The ability of the cell to read the right genes at the right time, and cells lose their identity over time, and that leads to the actual effects of aging. And we did an experiment in my lab where we caused DNA damage, but we didn't cause mutations. And that resulted in the cell having to move proteins to the site of damage, unravel the DNA, fix it, put it back together, and then reset that arrangement, both in 2D on the DNA and also in 3D in the nucleus. And we accelerated that by about threefold over normal for about 3 weeks in a mouse. And what we got was an exact mimic of aging, just at 2 to 3 times the normal rate. So I'm bullish on the idea that it's not the information that's lost over time on the DNA code. That's digital, and it's pretty hard to lose it. We have 2 copies of each. What's going wrong is the ability to actually read that information. It's instead of losing the compact disc, or I guess we don't use compact discs anymore. Instead of losing the DVD, it's just scratched. And what's important about that is that now that we believe we've got the information still in our bodies, we just need to teach the cells to read it again. So it's like polishing that DVD, and now you have rejuvenation. And so I think that it's quite possible to take someone who's quite old, in their 80s and 90s, and if you just are able to reverse that epigenetic drift or lack of epigenetic resilience at that age, you can get age reversal quite dramatically.
Okay, so I'm still not hearing radical life extension. So this is a way to be healthier longer. Is that both of your positions here? Are you thinking, out here in our community, and certainly when I was researching my book, there were a lot of people talking about living to be 1,000 or 10,000 or, forever. In fact, they made me put forever on my questionnaire because I just went up to 150, and that wasn't long enough for some people. Are we still talking about a fairly, maybe a little out there in terms of human lifespan, but not, dramatic, like living a millennia or something?
Well, I would say never. We're always learning things that we don't know. And there was a recent paper in the journal Nature that said that looking at the demographics currently, humans will not live beyond about 115, 120. But that's looking backwards. It'd be like predicting the Boeing 747 before the Wright brothers invented flight. So we're actually at that inflection point where we are learning to be able to manipulate lifespan. Whether we'll go to the moon or we'll slowly just invent biplanes, we don't know how long this is going to take. But I think it's possible. Anything's possible. But what I think we have to temper our enthusiasm with is the realization that developing these technologies takes decades. and we may have been born 1 or 2 generations too early to live that long. But I do think, and I'm on record, like you, saying that the first child to live 150 has already been born.
So you think with what you all are talking about, you could potentially push that out without any, genetic editing or other more radical technology?
So many things in nature, there's proximate mechanisms and ultimate outcome. And my personal interest in focusing on the proximate mechanism and get the public to really be excited about sustained health. But right now, when you focus on longevity, it ends up stopping the conversation and investment because you can't run longevity trials. No venture capital is going to fund something that doesn't have a regulatory path. You can't run an FDA trial on longevity. So by focusing on real-time proximate markers such as homeostatic capacity, which you can measure real-time, it converts the conversation about longevity to something you can do today, which makes it a viable regulatory path, which makes it investable. We actually have a chance of establishing it. So let longevity be a secondary or tertiary outcome. Let's just focus on sustained health and drive investment and interest to it.
Okay. Well, let's shift over to that for a second about, you were investing in companies. What are you investing in? What the two of you look at when, you're trying to develop actual products that people can use?
Right now, I'm focused on things that optimize the existing system. The healthcare 2.0, which is the current system. Healthcare 1.0 is the one nature endowed in us, right? That's the greatest invention ever, the ability to get the homeostasis on your own. After 40, it leaves you, so we create this $3 trillion moat around us called healthcare, which is a whack-a-mole system which helps extend quantity and quality of life, and then you die. That's the short history of healthcare. Now, in that system, it's a recursive profit model, which is unfortunate, but that's all we have right now, and we don't have the biomarkers to really improve homeostatic capacity. So that's still where we invest, but that's not good enough. So our secondary investments on the philanthropy side, which is to invest in something that could end the healthcare system, end aging, invalidate the entire model, put ourselves out of business is the goal. Because if we end homeostatic capacity and you put the homeostatic capacity back in your body after 40, where it was in the first place, then it'd be the end of chronic diseases. We still die of acute things, again, like trauma and infection, but it's a very different system that's much smaller. The healthcare system ought to be able to shrink by 90%, and we ought to get 10x the value. That kind of magnification is what we're chasing. Instead, we're doing very small innovations for small gains, for small investment, more for more, less for less. That's not that interesting, right? I think what's much more compelling is let's get dramatic improvements in health across the board, across the globe, and do it at a fraction of the cost. So investing-wise, we're sort of hedged, right? The current system is great. Let's laud all the great people doing the work. But let's take another path that would essentially put the current system out of business. Healthcare 3.0 will be putting the system back in the body. So investing-wise, we have sort of polar missions right now.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, the idea of living long, sort of philosophy. There are lots of issues that are raised by this. Have you all given, being leaders in this field, how do we transport maybe the great lives that some people are having with people who might sort of look at you and going, extending this life I'm leading, maybe not?
Wow, it's a tough one. I think that if you took a survey of everyone in this room, we're all having a great time. I can tell most people in this room have ADD. But we do enjoy our lives, and we really push the boundaries. But there are of course others who don't want to live longer. But I think it's always good to look back at history as a guide, and imagine we're in 1915. Fleming has is working on his fungus, and people are wondering what are we going to do if somebody has a radical invention. So with the advent of true antibiotics in the 1940s, I don't know this for a fact, but you can imagine that people had the same conversations. What are we going to do when nobody dies from a splinter and kids don't die and women don't die of childbirth? And it would be nuts now to look back and think, why were they worried? We do live in a better world. People can expect to live nearly twice as long. And I predict that when we can live twice as long, or our descendants can live twice as long, they'll look back at today and think, why were they worried? Why weren't they throwing $1 billion at this question? Because the future is so much better. Now, there are economic implications, no question. And the economic benefits far outweigh the costs. It's true that you can't retire anymore at 70 or 65, but we've been doing that for the last 50 years anyway. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather trade health, and even some longevity for having to find another career halfway through my life. But you know, you don't have to take the technologies if you don't want to live healthy and longer.
People often ask if there's an off switch when you talk about these technologies.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. So I think, you know, longevity, we're not forcing it on people. It just gives you an option. So, you know, it's a choice. So you can think about this as we're both pro-life and we're a pro-choice. We're the rare field that stands on both sides, right? So after 40, you start undergoing this declination. And, you know, in the wild, think about it as nature's way of getting rid of you, right? So you've served your purpose, and now all of a sudden you can't see, and so you're going to get eaten by a predator pretty quickly when you can't see. Now we have glasses to help defer that. And the second thing it does is it also robs you of your brain. You can't think anymore, so you're going to get selected as a backup plan. The tertiary plan is aging imparts suffering. So after a while, you stop fighting it. Like, oh, you know, death is a reasonable trade-off, a reasonable alternative to living with suffering. But, you know, we're not actually dying at those that high rates anymore. Now, in fact, we're living to 100. Somebody born today can expect to live 100. So things like, you know, what were the drivers of population growth? It's fertility. Fertility. Well, it was encoded in us to get married by or have kids by 13, try to teach everything to your kids for the next 9 years when you die. That was the average template. So till death do us apart, you know, it wasn't that big a commitment when the average tenure was 9 years, right? Even if you made a mistake, it's only 9 years of hell. But in the modern world, if you say till death do us apart, it might be 87 years with this person. And you ask yourself, do I really know I want to be with this person for the next 87 years? I'm going to do more due diligence. So most people kind of step back, stick around, delay mating, having kids, and then you run out of time and you have one kid. So empirically, 40% of the world right now lives in high longevity countries, and 100% of those are now experiencing below replacement fertility. So I think the Earth is full theory. You know, the data doesn't really support that. I saw boredom on there. I got to tell you, 1,000 years is not that long. I've been around, you know, my son's the one who tuned me into this. He said, Dad, 1,000 is a really small number because it's only 2050s. I got to tell you, I'm pushing 50, and it went by in a blink. Which means 1,000 years is 20 blinks. It's really short, guys. 1,000 years from now is tomorrow. It's not that long. And when you think about the entire arc of human history, which is, you know, 10,000 years of recorded human civilization, that's only 200 blinks, guys. It's not that long. So sticking around for 1,000 years is going to be amazing. It's not going to be boring. And once you unlock human capacity, the things that we're going to see, like David is alluding to, is going to be epic, right? I mean, good luck trying to do space travel with our existing biology. It's going to be sequential trips on a rocket ship. Now, that's boring, right? But in order to enable space travel, in order to escape this planet to find new territories, you have to have longevity. Longevity precedes everything.
But, you know, let's talk about who gets this. I mean, you may get it. In fact, everyone in this room. Let's say we have this technology available. That, you know, new technologies tend to be expensive. You know, not everyone gets access to them. But who actually gets this? And there actually really are people now that actually get bored, even with the current lifespan. So how do we apply this to everyone? I mean, you know, you said people can opt out, of course, but that isn't really what's happened over the last, 100 or 150 years. Everybody's ended up living longer. And so there are these issues that we may be creating a society that you will, have people who worry about relationships. That was another big one. How many times can it can be special for you, when you've had been married 23 times. How are we going to cope with these issues? And maybe we've already had a dry run since we have doubled lifespan already in the last 150 years, and we do seem to be more or less coping with it. But do you guys worry about those kind of things at all? David,
I think about them. I don't worry about them because I think that they're not something to worry about. Just to address one of the things you mentioned, which is the cost, will this really be available to an elite few, like the people in this room? And initially, all technology is expensive, some more than others. Anything biological is going to be more expensive and may remain that way for a long time because it's hard to produce. But the molecules that are being made by myself and others in the field, it cost a few cents to make. What makes them expensive is the R&D. And patents run out, and then you get the generics, and then after 15, 20 years, you can have these things that are only going to cost a few cents a day to make. And I think that way it will be widely available across the planet. And you might ask, well, why would somebody who's worrying more about malaria want to take these medicines. Well, what we found is that the defense mechanisms that provide longevity also provide defense mechanisms against disease and even infection and hyperinflammation. And so they're going to have other benefits besides just longevity, and people in the developing world could be more resilient as well and fight disease and recover as well. One area that I was surprised a few years ago was relevant to aging research was women's fertility. One company I started, Oversicience, was based on that, and so there are a number of women who have had children who couldn't otherwise by rejuvenating their eggs with a boost of energetics, mitochondria specifically. But now we have small molecules that can, at least in mice, can reverse infertility in mice that are equivalent of a 70-year-old. Now that brings, of course, ethical questions, but the technology is quite amazing in its reach, and often you don't expect the breadth of the impact on people's lives. And I think given that people are delaying, couples are delaying having children until much later, I think this is going to be a real benefit to society. The number of people that I've met through the latest work who are just really depressed and depressed about not being able to have kids because they left it too late, or they lacked fertility from the outset.
I mean, IVF has been an interesting example of access. I mean, the price is coming down slowly, but it still really is something that the average person can afford, and I think it's only insured in 2 states. So I guess you go to one of those states. So that's become a choice, you know, and on the other end of life, you know.
Yeah.
But it is. I mean, Oversicience, you know, your company and others are trying to bring that price down. So maybe.
Yeah, it's still high tech, real high tech. But I'm talking about a pill that a woman could pop for a few weeks and bring back her fertility. We even see, at least in mice, what we call the mousopause is reversed, and they get their hormone cycles back, which could, you know, even if you're not interested in children, could be a health benefit.
I think we're also all optimists. I think I'm hearing from you and from you that, you know, we generally have faith. I think we'll figure these things out. I mean, when you know, our one-liners, if you unlock human capacity, homeostatic capacity, you'll unlock human capacity. Humans will figure out through our ingenuity the solutions to all the problems that may result from this, including economic, you know, redistribution issues, you know, population issues. I think these will figure it out. I'm getting tons of feedback even from the evolution community that we're slowing down evolution by making people live longer. Of all the fields, I felt like we'd get embraced. And here's just something to keep in mind. Even there's an upside to all the arguments. You know, we were a hardware-based innovation system, right? Genes are an incredible way to innovate. Wouldn't it actually accelerate evolution to have longevity? I mean, that's probably the destiny of evolutionary biology, is that we're destined towards longevity, and we're just stuck in these dying bodies, and we're just the transition.
Although we lock in the gene pool, but I mean, I haven't heard either of you, you know, talk about living forever, literally. I mean, at some point, with all of these wonderful things we're talking about, we still do face death. I mean, is that an inevitability to the two of you?
Looking at today's technology, yes, but I can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow.
I think that's a separate discussion, and you know, it's also not like I'm not personally pursuing longevity. I'm doing none of the things that increase lifespan right now, because to me, it would be nice to shift the cultural conversation on longevity towards doing it for others instead of doing it for yourself. You take ego out of it, and you know, ego is what makes you make mistakes. If you do it for the generation that's on the brink right now, or leaving as a legacy to the kids, make it about others and have it be about stewardship. I think is a much more compelling conversation, because the end of life is the end of relationships. You lose so much more than just your life, right? So, and to really engage the public, I think, you know, instead of talking about things like how do I live forever, that's not an interesting conversation. That is such as clickbait. Rich guys want to live forever. I think this is much more about relationships, right? And what that powers. So, you know, I'm in the middle of my life. We all are. I mean, they say this is a midlife crisis. No, this is like, midlife is the greatest time. The people that love you most are still with you in many cases. The people you love most are in the bosom of your family. Midlife is the absolute sweet spot. And to make this about others instead of being your personal crisis is a way to kind of change the cultural conversation on longevity.
Or are you at the beginning, Jen?
Yeah, let's hope so. We're at
That's
the
what
end.
I meant. All right, well, thank you guys. That was great. Yeah.